Okay, in this video we're going to consider the problem of determining whether a given schedule is view serializable. Okay, so you should have seen the discussion of view serializability in the notes, but we're running through that anyway. So here's the example we've got. We've got two transactions, T1 and T2. Both of them behave pretty much the same. So they read X, they write X, then they read Y, then they write Y. So in the first case, the first schedule, it's a serial schedule, so T1 comes before T2. Now there's an assumption here as well that we've got begin transaction and commit transaction at the end of each of these sequences of operations. So in any case, in the second serial schedule, we've got T1 happening before T2. And here are two interleave schedules, and we want to determine whether each of those is view serializable. So let's take a look at schedule 1. Now if you remember, for view serializability, you've basically got to check whether a particular schedule is view equivalent to any of the serial schedules. So we'll start by checking whether schedule 1 is view equivalent to schedule B. Okay, so determine whether schedule 1 is view serializable, we need to check whether it's view equivalent to either of the serial schedules. So we'll start by comparing it to serial schedule B. Okay, and what we need to check is, first of all, who reads and who writes the various values of the variables. Okay, so for schedule B, the value of X is initially read by T2. Okay, so T2 is the schedule that reads the initial value of X. Okay, there's another read of X. This is one of the intermediate reads of X, and in this case T1 reads the value of X from T2, and finally the final value of X is produced here, and that comes from T1. So let's denote that like that. Right, so that's the behavior of X in schedule B. We could also determine something similar for Y, but let's take a look at schedule 1 instead. Okay, so here's schedule 1. What do we know about X? Well, what we know about X here is that the initial value of X is read by T1. Okay, well that's unfortunate. That means that there's a clash, and therefore the two schedules are not view equivalent. So we can stop at this point, and we've demonstrated that certainly schedule 1 is not view equivalent to the serial schedule B. Alright, so it's not view equivalent to B. Okay, so now we need to check the view equivalence of serial schedule A against schedule 1. Okay, so to do that, looking at schedule A and considering first the variable X, so the first reading of X in this schedule here is by T1. So T1 reads, let's denote the initial value of X by XA. Then there's another read of X here. Where does that X come from? Well, it's the X that's written by T1. So T2 reads X from T1. And where's the final value of X written? Well, it's written here by T2. So T2 writes the final value of X, which I'll denote by X underscore Z. So we've got XA and XZ indicating the initial and final values. Alright, so let's take a look at variable Y. Who reads who's the first reader of Y in this schedule? Well, clearly it's T1, because T1 does everything before T2 does anything. So T2 reads YA. Then what value of Y does T2 read? It reads the value that was written by T1. So T2 reads Y from T1. And who writes the final value of Y? Well, since T2 is the second transaction, then obviously it writes the final value of Y. Alright, well, let's compare that to the concurrent schedule, schedule 1. So what happens with X? Who's the first reader of X? Well, that's T1. So T1 reads initial value of X. Which value of X does T2 read? You can see from these two instructions here that it reads the value of X that was written by T1. And who writes the final value of X? Well, if you look along the timeline, the final write of X is there. So T2 writes the final value of X. Okay, so far so good. What about Y? The variable Y. Okay, who reads the Y first in schedule 1? Well, it's this read here, and it's T1. So T1 reads YA, initial value of Y. There's another read of Y which occurs here. Which version of Y is being read there? And it's the one that was written by T1. So T2 reads Y from T1. And the final write of Y occurs here, and that's done by T2. So T2 writes YZ. Okay, so we can see from these two things that both of those variables are treated the same in each of the schedules. Therefore, these two schedules are view equivalent, and we can say that schedule 1 is view serializable. Okay, so that's schedule 1. So we saw that on the initial thing we had another schedule where we've got significant interleaving of the operations. Alright, so let's check whether there's view equivalence here. Alright, so if we look at serial schedule A and schedule 2, let's take a look at how the variables are treated in A. So the variable X is first read by T1, and the value, the other read of X, happens in T2, and it's reading the value that was written by T1. So T2 reads. And finally, who writes the last value of X? Well, it's this right here, and that's done by T2. So T2 writes the final value of X. Right, what about Y? And this should be pretty obvious from before, because clearly serial schedule A does everything in T1 before T2. So T1 is going to read the initial value of Y. The value of Y that T2 reads is the one that was written by T1. And T2 is the one that writes the final value of Y, YZ. Okay, so let's have a look at schedule 2. What happens with variable X? Well, T2 reads the initial value of X, and at that point we realize that these two schedules are not view equivalent. So we can stop checking there. So schedule 2 is not view equivalent to the serial schedule A. Question is it view equivalent to serial schedule B? So let's do the analysis there. Okay, so serial schedule B is where we've got T2 before T1, so pretty easy to see. T2 reads the initial value of X, and T1 reads a value of X that was written by T2, and T1 writes the final value of X. As for Y, T2 does the initial read of Y, T1 reads the value of Y that was written by T2 because T2 went first, and finally T1 writes the final value of Y. Alright, let's look at schedule 2. For variable X, T2 reads the initial value of X, well, that's a good start. Which value of X does T1 read? Well, unfortunately, T1 also reads the initial value of X. It doesn't read the version that was written by T2. So even just this much analysis tells us that schedule 2 is not view equivalent to serial schedule B. Now we've already seen that that schedule 2 is not view equivalent to serial schedule A. They're the only two possible serial schedules. So if it's not view equivalent to either of those two schedules, it's therefore not view serializable. Okay, so there's a quick example of view serializability.